The air in Essen didn't smell like air. It smelled like pulverized brick and the sour, metallic tang of old cooking grease that had been burnt into the upholstery of a million destroyed lives. It was April 1945, but the spring hadn't reached the Ruhr. The sun was a pale, sickly coin tossed into a sky of slate-colored dust. If you breathed too deep, your teeth felt gritty. That was the first thing you noticed, the grit. It was in the bread, if you had bread. It was in your eyelashes. It was the sediment of a thousand-year empire coming down in a rain of soot. Behind a jagged tooth of a wall, once a pharmacy, now just a pile of porcelain shards and splinters, a boy named Klaus sat. He was 9, but his face had the pinched, cynical architecture of a man of 50. He was watching the road. The road was where the noise came from, not the screaming whistle of the Lancasters anymore, but a low, rhythmic thrum, a heartbeat. The Americans were coming, and they didn't march, they rolled. They moved with a casual, terrifying grace. They didn't look like soldiers from the newsreels, they looked like mechanics who had accidentally inherited the earth. And then there was the smell. Before you saw the faces, you smelled them. It wasn't the smell of wood smoke and cabbage and unwashed wool that had defined Germany for 4 years. It was the smell of the American pocket. That is the motif of this collapse, isn't it? The pocket. Not the Ruhr pocket where 300,000 Germans were being squeezed into a surrender, but the literal pockets of the boys from Ohio and New Jersey. Those pockets were miracles of geometry. They were bottomless. They defied the physics of a continent that had learned to measure everything by the gram. A German soldier's pocket held a dry crust, a photograph of a girl who had probably already been bombed, and perhaps a single, precious cigarette butt. But the American pocket? It was a cornucopia. It held tins of meat that opened with a key. It held chocolate that didn't taste like sawdust. It held gasoline-scented rags and silver Zippos. And most importantly, it held the pink stuff. Klaus watched a jeep pull to a halt near the pharmacy ruins. The driver didn't jump out with a rifle. He leaned back. He put his boots up on the dashboard. He looked at the ruins not with the eyes of a conqueror, but with the weary indifference of a tourist who had seen too many cathedrals. His name was Miller, or maybe it was Davis. It doesn't matter. He was the ambassador of abundance. He reached into that olive-drab pocket, that Mary Poppins bag of democratic logistics, and pulled out a small, flat rectangle wrapped in bright, waxy paper. The paper was a color that didn't exist in the Ruhr. It was a loud, vulgar, beautiful pink. Klaus didn't move. You don't move when you're a stray dog. You wait for the kick or the crumb. Miller looked at the boy. He didn't say anything about the master race or the liberation. He just flicked the rectangle through the air. It landed in the gray dust at Klaus's feet, a splash of neon in the ash. Klaus picked it up. His fingers were stained dark with coal dust. He peeled the wrapper. The scent hit him, a chemical explosion of wintergreen and sugar so potent it made his sinuses ache. He had forgotten that things could smell like this. He had forgotten that sweet was a category of existence. He put it in his mouth. It was hard at first, then it softened. It wasn't food. You couldn't swallow it, not really. It was a toy you played with your teeth. "Blow," Miller said from the jeep. He made a gesture with his hands, a rounding motion in front of his face. Klaus looked at him, uncomprehending. The other children were emerging now. They came out of the cellars like rats, blinking in the pale light. They stood in a semicircle around the jeep, a chorus of hollow cheeks and oversized coats. They were waiting for the catch. In their experience, something this sweet always came with a price. A lecture, a bullet, a betrayal. Miller took a piece for himself. He chewed with a rhythmic, bovine intensity. Then he did it. He leaned forward and a pink sphere grew from his lips. It grew larger than a fist. It was translucent, shimmering in the dull light of Essen, reflecting the jagged silhouettes of the broken factories. It was a perfect, fragile orb of pure American excess. And then, pop! The children flinched. They actually jumped back, expecting an explosion. But Miller just laughed. He peeled the thin, sticky skin of the bubble off his nose and started chewing again. He handed out more, a whole handful. He rained pink rectangles onto the Ruhr dust. Klaus tried. He pushed his tongue into the center of the mass and blew. It took 3 tries. On the 4th, a small, lopsided bubble emerged. It stayed there, wobbling on his lip. It was a miracle of chemistry. It was synthetic rubber and refined sugar, things the Reich had spent years trying to synthesize in labs to win a war. And here was a bored boy from Pittsburgh using them to make a joke in the middle of a graveyard. And that's when Klaus started to cry. He didn't sob like a child who'd scraped his knee. It was a dry, racking sound, a heave of the chest. Then the others started. A girl with braids, her coat held together by twine, looked at her own tiny bubble, and her face simply fell apart. They weren't crying because they were hungry. They were crying because the bubble was too light. Do you understand the weight of that lightness? For 12 years, everything in their world had been heavy. The boots were heavy. The speeches were heavy. The steel of the Kruppwerks was heavy. The propaganda was a leaden weight on the tongue, full of destiny and blood and soil. Even their toys, if they had them, were cast iron soldiers and wooden tanks. Everything was designed to last 1,000 years. Everything was built for the grave. And then comes this piece of pink rubber. It is the ultimate expression of a civilization that can afford to be frivolous. A nation that has so much sugar, so much rubber, and so much time that it can manufacture something specifically designed to be chewed up and thrown away. It was the sheer, arrogant wastefulness of the bubblegum that broke them. It was the realization that while they had been eating tulip bulbs and scavenging for coal, there was a place across the ocean where people spent their genius on making bubbles. How do you fight a country that makes bubbles? You don't. You just sit in the dirt and realize your gods were frauds. The tears were a funeral for a world of hardness. The hardness had failed. The lightness had arrived in a jeep. Miller, the driver, looked uncomfortable. He wasn't a historian. He didn't see the metaphor. He just saw a bunch of dirty kids crying over a piece of candy. He reached into his pocket again, that infinite, oily pocket, and pulled out a tin of K-rations and a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. He tried to offer them, but the children were focused on the gum. They weren't chewing anymore. They were holding the bubbles out, trying to keep them from popping. They wanted to save the air inside, as if the air from a GI's lungs was different from the soot-filled air of the Ruhr. And maybe it was. Maybe that air was flavored with Ohio. The history books talk about the Marshall Plan. They talk about the billions of dollars, the tons of grain, the reconstruction of the bridges, and the denazification of the schools. But the real Marshall Plan happened in the mouths of the children. It was a chemical conversion.
Imagine the logistics required for that moment. To get that piece of gum into Klaus's hand, a factory in Brooklyn had to churn. A merchant marine had to dodge U-boats in the North Atlantic. A truck had to rumble through the mud of France. A supply sergeant had to check a clipboard in a depot in Leech. All of that, the entire weight of the American industrial machine, was funneled down into a 3-cent piece of pink elastic. It was the most expensive nothing in the history of warfare. The Ruhr was the heart of the German war machine. It was the forge. It was where the tigers and the panthers were born. It was a place of fire and hammers. And yet, the forge was conquered by a bubble. The steel was defeated by sugar. As the jeep pulled away, Miller tossed one last pack of gum. He didn't look back. He had a war to finish, or at least a road to follow until someone told him to stop. He left behind a trail of pink wrappers that fluttered in the wind like the confetti of a very grim parade. Klaus stood there, the taste of artificial fruit still coating his teeth. He looked at the wall of the pharmacy. He looked at his hands. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a part of a folk. He didn't feel like a brick in a wall. He just felt like a boy with a sticky face. The abundance wasn't just about food. It was about the permission to be silly. It was the freedom to waste. In a world of scarcity, everything is sacred. In a world of abundance, you can blow a bubble and watch it pop and it doesn't matter, because there's always another piece in the pocket.
That is a terrifying kind of power. It's the power of the unending. Later that night, in the cellar, Klaus tried to explain it to his mother. She didn't believe him. She thought he was hallucinating from the hunger. "A bubble?" she asked, her voice thin as a wire. "Out of rubber?" "It didn't break," he whispered, "until I wanted it to." That was the confession. That was the secret. For the first time, he had control over something fragile. The state couldn't pop his bubble. The bombs couldn't pop it. Only he could. We look back at these moments and we see victory. But if you were there in the mud of Essen, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a deep spiritual exhaustion. It was the moment the German soul realized it had been outproduced, not just in bullets, but in joy. The tears were the sound of the hardness melting. They were the sound of a country realizing it wanted to be the kind of place where you could cry over gum. Look at the advertisement from that era, the bright colors, the smiling faces. It looks like a lie when you compare it to the ruins of the Ruhr, but to Klaus, that ad was a map to a different planet, a planet where the pockets were always full and the air didn't smell like bricks. The Ruhr stopped screaming that day. The factories were silent. The sirens were quiet. There was only the sound of a few hundred children standing in the rubble, chewing. The rhythmic, wet sound of 1,000 tiny miracles. Miller probably went home to a farm in Iowa. He probably never told anyone about the gum. He probably complained about the price of gas and the humidity. He never knew that he was a priest of a new religion. He never knew that his pocket was an altar. But Klaus remembered. Years later, when the Ruhr was green again, when the chimneys were smoking with the productive fires of peace, he would still see a piece of pink paper in the street and feel a phantom ache in his chest. Not a pain, just a reminder. A reminder of the day the world was saved by something that didn't matter. History isn't made of treaties. It's made of the things we cry about when we finally realize we're allowed to be human again. And in 1945, in the middle of a cratered wasteland, humanity was a pink bubble wobbling in the wind, refusing to pop until it was ready. The crying eventually stopped. The children swallowed the sugar. They saved the rubber as long as they could, stretching it between their fingers until it was gray and tasteless, a relic of the day the giants arrived. They kept the wrappers in their pockets like icons. Because if someone can give you a bubble that actually bubbles, they might just be able to give you a tomorrow that actually happens. And that is why they cried, not for what they had lost, but for the unbearable, beautiful lightness of what they were about to gain. A world where a bubble isn't a miracle, a world where a bubble is just a bubble. The jeep disappeared into the dust. The silence returned, but the grit was gone from Klaus's teeth. There was only the lingering ghost scent of wintergreen. The Ruhr was conquered, not by the sword, but by the pocket.